Hello, I am Pastor Matthew Verhoeg, and this is a commentary of Luke chapter 14, verses 25 to 35. We get to see here a transitional passage which lies between Jesus sort of leaving off of the Pharisees for the meal and beginning into a large section where Jesus is going to speak about discipleship in a lot of different ways. So let's get right into the text here, and we can see Luke 14:25. This is my translation. And great crowds were going along with him, and turning, he said to them. And the them here is important because Jesus had been addressing his disciples or Jewish leaders, but here is one of the few times where Jesus directly addresses the crowds. And what he's going to say is pretty surprising because we often think of a crowd, think of ways that we can gather a crowd or keep a crowd. And Jesus, now that he has this crowd going along with them, is going to warn them about the cost of discipleship. This text reminds me a little of John chapter 6, where Jesus has the giant crowds after feeding them with bread, and then Jesus says a bunch of things that make them leave, and he begins he asks the disciples, "Are you going to go away too?" And Peter says, "To where shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." And that's always kind of been a text for myself, where I think, even with the frustrations in the church and following Christ, these are the words of life, and this is why we study it so closely. We want to see they were going along with him, and so the sense of the crowd traveling teaches us that this is Jesus going to Jerusalem and to what awaits him in Jerusalem, which is ultimately dying on the cross. And so this warning that he's going to give about the cost of discipleship is very relevant because this giant crowd, many of them are going to shrink away when things begin to get difficult. So turning, he said to them, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, even yet his own life, he is not able to be my disciple." So we get this, you might think it's one of these things, but it's and. So you have to hate father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters. And so all of these things, Calvin has a great line here in talking about how, obviously this can't be strictly literal because Jesus commands many things like Luke 10:27, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength, and you should love your neighbor as yourself. And so we are literally commanded to love all of these people. How is Jesus asking us to hate them? And so this is hyperbolic in a way, and yet, we'll go with Calvin's phrase here. It would be absurd to insist on a literal interpretation of the phrase, as if no man were a disciple of Christ till he threw into the sea all that he possessed, divorced his wife, and bade farewell to his children. Now, Calvin almost being a little snarky there, and this is obviously, God does not want us to do this, but in saying hate his own brother, we get a sense where nothing can command a higher allegiance than Christ. In fact, we get to see this parallel text, and I'll bring it up for you in Matthew 10:37. "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will save it." And here it's a little softer. Loves father and mother more than me. More than me. And we get the same, except Luke is giving this harsher version of this phrase, where it's hate father or mother or sister. And the sense is, it's, we use this comparative language that uh, with something like a sports team, like I hate the Dallas Cowboys. It's like I really don't care about the Dallas Cowboys, but I love my Philadelphia Eagles so much that in comparison, I hate them. And so your love of God is going to be so great that in comparison, even your father or mother is going to be like nothing to you. And this takes a critical dimension in the early church, when many Jewish believers, where accepting Christ meant saying goodbye to one's family. And the people who saw you accepting Christ would take that as hating them. And then social pressure would be enormous. And you can see this today in Muslim countries. You can see this today in Asian countries, where so many people were accepting Christ is going to be taken as a rejection of family. Now God upholds the importance of family, but it will be taken that way by many. Calvin also gives a great sort of comment here. Let the husband then love his wife, and the father his son. And on the other hand, let the son love his father, provided that reverence which is due to Christ be not overpowered by human affection. And that is, I think, what this is teaching here. For if even among men, in proportion to the closeness of the tie that mutually binds us, some have stronger claims than others, it is shameful that all should not be deemed inferior to Christ alone. And so the claim to affection to Christ is the highest ever. And so in comparison, it is like hating father or mother. Luke goes on to talk about bearing cross. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me is not able to be my disciple. And this is very close to the verse we saw 5 chapters ago, Luke 9:23. If anyone can come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. So here we get to see bearing cross, and we remember the setting. Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem in chapter 9, and here Jesus going with the crowd to Jerusalem, warning that the cross that he is going to bear to the hill is going to be a picture of what following Christ is going to be. It's going to be hard, it's going to be sacrifice, and we will look at the language here closely, where bear and come are both present verbs. And so these present verbs tell us that this bearing of the cross, coming after Jesus, can be something daily to be Jesus' disciple. It's speaking of the hard work it's going to be to day by day to suffer the difficulty of following Christ. And this is Paul saying in Philippians 3, I count everything as loss for the all-surpassing gain of Jesus Christ. Yeah. Finding Jesus to be more valuable. And bearing a cross here, Jesus is quite literally going to bear a cross. There are disciples who are going to quite literally bear a cross. And this is the difficulties of the Christian life in following Christ. The business deals that we might be missing out on. All of the things that we have to sacrifice. And Jesus is saying this is part of following him. And in fact, it's a good thing, because this is the way of discipleship, because our master carried his cross before us. Now Jesus is going to give 2 little parables, and they're pictures of what this discipleship looks like. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count up the expenses? You can see someone at a table, a spreadsheet, like figuring out if he has enough to complete it, lest laying its foundation and not having enough to finish, all who look on it will begin, I find mistakes, will begin to ridicule him, saying, this is the man who began to build and couldn't afford to complete. And so the picture here, the parable, is of discipleship, and Jesus is talking about how hard it is. And so it's hard, like building a tower. We think of the laborious birth. This is probably a guard tower for a private residence, which might be 2-3 stories to protect against intruders breaking into a vineyard or the surrounding fields. And if you're going to start, you better finish, because nobody wants to see this half-finished thing. I remember there was this half-finished house in my old town. It had tie par, the old wrap around it, and there was some jest made at the person. And if you're going to follow Christ, see how hard it is. See bearing the cross. See what Jesus is saying about the difficulty. Make sure that you can complete it to the end, or else you will end up being ashamed. Secondly, another picture which is very similar. Or what king, going against another king to meet in war, does not first sit down and take counsel, if he with 10,000 are able to meet 20,000 coming against him? And if not, indeed, while he is yet far off, if not, indeed, this is the Greek phrasing, while he is yet far off, sending a delegation, he will ask for terms of peace. And the implication in terms of peace is probably like he's going to surrender or give him gold or whatever you do to prevent someone coming against you in war. I find this fascinating, this phrase, this part about 10,000, because Jesus is saying that following him is like being in a battle with 10,000 people against 20. It's like 2-to-1 odds, and in normal military times, like that might be a slaughter if you have equal troop strength. And it's a picture of the Christian life, a picture like the mustard seed, which is going to look weak in the eyes of the world. And yet, the thing is, with God here, the 10,000 are ultimately, with God, going to overcome. They're going to have victory, and yet it is going to be hard. And so Jesus says, look, it's going to be hard to follow me. And if you can't take the poor odds of looking at an army of 20,000 coming against you, get out now. Get out now. Now, the crowds here with these two pictures who are crowding around Jesus, they really want to follow him, and he warns them that not to start following on this path unless you're going to go all the way to Jerusalem, all the way bearing the cross. And it's a warning that still speaks to us today. And even in times where following Christ might not cost us that much, maybe it's just because we have taken a form of Christianity that just gets along with the world. And maybe a costless Christianity isn't quite Christian. Count the cost. So, verse 33, so therefore, all from you, this is a mistranslation here. Therefore, if you do not say farewell to all that he owns or you own, therefore, that's it. So therefore, the one who does not say farewell to all that he owns is not able to be my disciple. I love this. So this picture, and this gets to our word study of the day, farewell. And some have forsake here, but I really like farewell as a translation, and you'll see why I take this if you want to look at. So this word farewell is apathesetai, and we can see this in a couple places. So taken leave here, and after he had apathesetai, taken leave of them, and then Luke 9:61, Lord, first I must apathesetai, say farewell to those. And after this, Paul stayed many days longer, and then apathesetai, took leave of the brothers, and so I took leave of them and went on Macedonian. Every time it's used in the New Testament, except in this case, it means to take leave of, to say farewell to. So the lexicon says from apostasso, which is from the root of this, which is to part from, take leave of, to say goodbye to, and figuratively of possessions to renounce, to say goodbye to. And I like this. So all that we have to follow Christ, we should say goodbye to. Because in following Christ, it is no longer our own, but the Lord's. It's dedicated to his purpose, and we may have to give up every penny in order to follow Christ. The New Testament does not talk a lot about tithing, and sometimes people treat it like, I'm going to give my 10%, I'm good. And yet, God calls us to say goodbye to our ownership of every cent, every house, every car, everything that we own, all our possessions. And if we're not willing to part with all of them, we are not able to be Jesus' disciple. Jesus closes with kind of a curious phrase. Therefore, salt is good, but if salt becomes tasteless, how could it become salty? It is not fit for the ground, nor the manure pit. It is cast out. The one having ears to hear, let him hear. So the first question you might have, how can salt lose its saltiness? Salt just disappears. Now, that's because the salt they had back then was not pure salt, but salt from evaporation that would have quite a few impurities in it. So you have this salt that might be like half of what we consider salt, and other is gypsum and other things from the sea. And if it got wet and exposed to heat, the salt part of it could leach out in such a way, and so you would be left with just the impurities, and you wouldn't have the salt. And this is something that apparently happened quite a bit. And it's this not salty salt isn't fit for the ground or the manure pit. And the commentaries here tell me something that is weird. And this is like salt might be good for cropland, which is not true. Salt is not good for cropland in almost any case. And it's not really good for the manure pit either. And I think here, this is just my farmer vision coming out, that fit for the ground is what they're using the salt for, is for paths or around buildings in some way, as kind of a weed killer to prevent unwanted weeds from growing up in places. Like, so we might use crushed limestone in a place to keep weeds from growing. And the same thing in the manure pit. They might put salted over top to keep weeds from growing. That's kind of my theory. But from what I've read, nobody totally understands why they would use salt in this way, but they did. And anyways, if it wasn't salty, it wouldn't be good for any of these things, and it would be cast out. And that's the phrase we should take note of, because this is a warning. Let the one having ears to hear, let him hear. And so this discipleship, again, you need to count the cost, because if you are going to be like salt but then fall away, it's going to be even worse for you. And so count the cost to follow Christ, because ultimately you will be cast out. Those disciples that don't go all the way, that turn back from following him. Jesus gives this disciple this warning, and it's a very apt warning, because many of those following him on that time up to Jerusalem would not continue to follow him after the cross, after they saw the suffering and the difficulty and cost. There would be only 120 disciples in the upper room, and there's these thousands following him now. Where did they all go? Now, this might be the same in the church today, where many go along following, but they have not counted the cost. And the warning here is, don't become unsalty salt, because ultimately it will be cast out. Thanks. I hope you enjoyed this commentary, and I hope you learned a lot if you're doing a Bible study or something in order to apply this to your own life and to help others for the glory of God.